Hi. I'm Gauti Eggertsson. Yes, I was asked to lead the discussion, so I'm going to do my best. So the topic here that we're going to discuss is inflation at the crossroads, and I think it's fair that to say that it is very much at the crossroads in the following sense. Uh, the last time we had a big surge in inflation was in the 1970s, uh, and then nothing comparable has happened since after the COVID-19. So in the aftermath of that, there was a surge starting in 2000 and uh, 2001 that we are really just starting to see come down now. So I guess the interesting question now is it going to settle? And we thought we might be able to predict something about that based on our existing models. But then, of course, as you all know, in the last couple of months, we have seen the most radical changes in trade policy that we have seen, I think, basically since the beginning of the Great Depression with the Smoot-Hawley Act. And one of the question is that I would like to pose, I'm trying to pose it to myself, and I don't have an answer to it, is if, I mean, uh, a lot of these tariffs are coming into effect, what do we think that is going to do to inflation? Um, just as a way of uh, comparison, so the Tariff Act was in 1930. So the Great Depression starts in 1929 with the stock market crash. So then in June 1930, uh, Herbert Hoover signs an act which basically increased tariffs by about 60%. Order of magnitudes are, so that's among the highest in US history. And the reaction of other countries was predictable. They just retaliated. And in that case, the US was already experiencing quite a bit of deflation. And it seemed like the sort of negative demand effect of this tariff war was actually to accelerate the inflation. But most of the discussion we have heard over the last few weeks has been that the tariffs will in fact increase inflationary pressures. And I think the honest answer is that we really don't know. Well, I'll be curious to hear the panel's take on it because we haven't seen anything like this basically since we need to go back almost 100 years to see any, and that's during a very unusual circumstance, after the biggest financial crisis we have seen, bigger than the Great Recession. So anyway, let's get started. I'm not just talking myself.
Gauti, can I just ask you a question? So
Yeah,
can you just explain like what did Herbert Hoover have in mind? Like why did anyone think at the time in 1930 that suddenly raising tariffs a lot was a good idea? I don't know enough about the
it's a good
history.
it's a good question. I mean, I'm just starting to look into it, and it's trying to just look some specialists on the Great Depression, but the tariffs have actually never been anything that I have studied in particular, and I guess I should now, because that was a major shock, and I've always focused more on the banking aspect and I've actually focused more on the recovery. But one of the interesting aspects also of the recovery that I've discovered recently is that uh, FDR actually lifted or did away with most of these tariffs.
Hmm.
So that's the story of the Great Depression that people have not really talked much about in general, I think. I mean, there's some historian. I mean, it's not the first time you probably have heard about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. But, for me, it is not something I focused on. Um,
Well, just
so
funny with
let's,
the title of our chat today, because the turbulent
mhm.
times is just these things that, like, we never studied tariffs in any significant way in graduate school because it was just viewed as something that was of purely historic interest. And now we
Yeah,
have
even
to go back to all
there's
those history books.
yeah, there's the whole field on international trade that largely just died because nobody was imposing any tariffs. So, you know, there's nothing to study. So they started just doing sort of urban economics or also just, you know, they're not really as directly related to tariff policy as the origin of the field was. So the, you know, the free trade has been the order of the day really since World War II, to a large extent. And so it is at least in the US. So it is really unprecedented, these latest development. So, I mean, it's an interesting question for Herbert too, what of his motivation, and I think even it's also an interesting question what is motivating Trump. I think in response to what is motivating Trump, the way he speaks is oftentimes as if he views a trade deficit as a loss and a state surplus as a profit, like a company, which, you know, is economists have known or thought they knew that was the wrong way of thinking about it. In fact, the very first economist, Adam Smith, wrote a book, Wealth of Nations, in 1776, which was about debunking this view, which was then called mercantilism. So it's sort of ironic that here we are, you know, all these hundreds of years later, and we have a president who's literally preaching something we thought the first economist had debunked. Now he may have other more. Well, there's always this tension with Trump. You're never quite sure if he means what he says, and it sounds pretty silly, or there's some five-dimensional chess going on, and you know, there's always these two conflicting narratives. Oh, he's using this to pressure to get this and that, and you know. So let me not do all the talking, and instead turn it over to our first panelist, Sunny Malhotra. And I can see here that you have talked a little bit about, you've written about, you know, green industrial policy and how that relates to the Inflation Reduction Act. So perhaps you can relate that to how we brought inflation down. Although, if I were to guess, a lot of that industrial policy has gone out the window with the current administration. Or
Um,
that's a question. I mean, he issued
yeah,
1,000 executive orders, so who knows what he did.
yeah, just a quick introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Sunny Malhotra. I'm a senior research associate for the Roosevelt Institute and Roosevelt Forward, our C4 arm. Roosevelt's a great place. A lot of people have different opinions, and my opinions are my own, not reflecting. Just to get the legalese out of the way. But yeah, so my background is in political economy, and my first couple of years at Roosevelt, I studied a lot on green industrial policy, researching what we call like the Big Four laws that Biden passed: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, American Rescue Plan Act, CHIPS and Science, and Inflation Reduction Act. The influence that these had, or that the Inflation Reduction Act in particular had on inflation, is a little iffy. It's not clear that that was actually the real goal. The real goal was to strengthen supply chains and to boost renewable energy production in the US, and basically just to kickstart a deliberate industrial policy. In the past, US has had a de facto industrial policy through like the military industrial complex and sort of government contracts, but this was a very deliberate effort to use industrial policy in a clear way, like a FDR sort of style way. There's no really doubt that these big four industrial policy bills had a very real impact on boosting renewable energy, and also a very real impact in bringing down costs for healthcare. And for example, the Inflation Reduction Act was also supposed to bring down a deficit by properly staffing the IRS. So unfortunately, the industrial policy efforts did change things, but they didn't really shift the underlying powers that were the real causes of economic distress. It didn't shift the underlying like the power dynamics of our current economic system that basically entrench fossil fuels, for example. So because of what a lot of folks are calling a dirty deal with like the senators at the time that were sort of the 50th and 51st like votes for the Inflation Reduction Act, like the IRA basically locked in fossil fuel contracts for public lands. So before a public land could be auctioned off to a renewable like offshore wind or even onshore wind, a set number of public land had to be first offered to fossil fuel companies. So this is just one example of the way that the industrial policy has sort of made strides and brought in a lot of investment, but did not change the underlying sort of power dynamics and the real cause of economic distress that are of what we see today. And also the second part of this, what you were alluding to later, was that where headway was made under the Biden administration, this current administration is going back and really gutting a lot of the sort of more powerful ways that the IRA tried to change and shift power. We see this in antitrust law especially, but also, for example, recently the EPA decided that it would just not it would cut the greenhouse gas reduction fund, a way for vulnerable communities to get funding that they would have not necessarily had because of lack of resources. And this fund was set up specifically for people who are most impacted by climate change to have financing for renewable energy. Now, the EPA is basically saying that they're stopping this because of fraud, and there is simply no evidence of that. Even a judge scoffed at the idea that there's evidence of fraud. So if there's one thing I do want to get across, it's that we cannot exclude the power dynamics and the political forces behind this. Just sort of, and we will be talking about interest rates, we'll be talking about a lot of economic forces. But one thing I also want to highlight is that my colleague Ira is not here today because in protest of Colombia's unjust expulsion of these protesting students and also their failure to protect Mahmoud Khalil from detainment from ICE. This is just another way that we cannot unlink these two. We cannot unlink power, political power, and economic power, especially when our current inflation, a lot of evidence shows that it's being driven by wealthy consumer spending. So growing wealth gap may be the primary or maybe a very real cause of our current system of inflation, and also the failure of industrial policy to really adjust these things is very important. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and discuss further.
So I see next on the list here is Andy Nevin, who I'm known for longer than I care to remember, 30 years maybe. So I guess you can start with introducing yourself. And I guess I was interested in hearing your take on what you think is, what's your evaluation on the current situation, the inflation situation. Where do you think we're going forward? What is going to be the effect of these tariffs war if they start gearing up? I mean, I think, yeah, we're still talking about even the signs. And, you know, even in the absence of tariff wars, do you think that the inflation surge we saw was essentially or was over, and now we just have a whole new stage of developments that God knows where it's going to lead us? It's a bit all over the place, but the world is all over the place now.
Well, great. I'll try to be brief because I really want to hear from Ricardo, thinking about these views from the other side of the ocean. But so I spent 20 years in the Federal Reserve and then a few years at the IMF. Now I've been at Dartmouth for about 10 years. So just like Sunny, my views are my own and only taken with a grain of salt. But I think Karen Tynan gave a really compelling presentation here at Dartmouth last fall. And she was an official in the Obama administration, in the Treasury Department. And their conclusion, was that a big part of the reason for the pickup in inflation in 2021 was because demand just exceeded supply in a pretty remarkable way. And it's not surprising in retrospect. It was a historic magnitude of the amount of fiscal stimulus that was put in a very short period. And there were people like Larry Summers who were uneasy about it and warning about it at the time. I'm curious, maybe Sunny can come back to this. I think what I felt at the time, I was already had been at Dartmouth now for a number of years by that point, was that better public policies are ones where there's contingency planning. And so you say, well, we need to make some major adjustments to the structure of the economy. let's build them in over a longer period of time, rather than trying to do everything right at the same point when the supply chains were still very restricted. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is that the Federal Reserve was asleep at the wheel, and Gauti has written about this a little bit. He was very diplomatic. I'll probably be less diplomatic today. That as soon as all the fiscal stimulus was in place, and as soon as Larry Summers was making warnings, and others, that the Fed should have prepared to change course, probably should have wound down its balance sheet programs. It should have been ready to start raising rates if needed. And it didn't do any of that really until 2022. And there were no dissents. So there's 12 people on the Federal Open Market Committee that makes monetary policy, though all those votes were unanimous during 2021. And so again, Gauti's written about this with Don Cohn, but how do you create organizations where people feel free to disagree? And a benefit of the Federal Reserve in principle is to have people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives who do feel free to disagree. In fact, I think what's happened to the Fed increasingly over 5, 10, 20 years is more and more deference to the chair. The chair, it's like a corporate board. The Fed chair runs the organization and everyone else are subordinates whose responsibility is simply to support the chair. So consequently, we're now in a situation, it's really very uneasy to me, Gauti, 4 years later, consumer service inflation still running at around 4%, even in this latest CPI. The goods prices have generally been much more subdued. But even apart from the tariffs, which haven't, whatever they're going to do, it hasn't probably started to be felt much in the CPI. That the Fed's created a situation where inflation's well above its target. Now, the Fed could have changed the target. They could have said, look, in retrospect, after 10 years of slow recovery and subdued inflation, that the target should be 3 or 4, fine. Okay, but in fact, what we're in a situation now is the target itself has lost credibility. So this morning, there's a University of Michigan consumer sentiment survey.
Can I push back you?
Oh, please, go ahead.
I mean, because I'm a little skeptical of the Michigan survey by itself, but is there any indication in the markets that the Fed?
No, not at all. But that's sad, Gauti. I mean, but I maybe finish my thought, and then we could open this to more discussion. Okay, what I wanted to say is that the Fed has never worked very hard to communicate the inflation target and the rationale for it to the general public, to small business people and consumers. I was there at the Fed in 2012. I was actually there working as a senior staffer when the target was adopted. And there was a conscious decision by public affairs at the Federal Reserve Board not to publicize the target. Bernanke thought it would be a good idea, but the staff were resistant to it. And so I think that's created problems, and those problems could get very bad now this year if, in fact, the tariffs start to push up prices of a lot of imported goods. We'll see. It's hard to guess, but I think part of the uneasiness of consumers that you're seeing in the Michigan survey is not that they don't have inflation forecast models. So I think I would just interpret their answers of where do you think inflation is going to be over the next 5 to 10 years as mostly just unease. Okay, what you don't see in the answers is a contrast, by the way, to Canada, where people have understood now for several decades the Bank of Canada's commitment to keeping inflation low and stable at the target. That in the United States, I don't think people have that sense. And so when they see worries about how these tariffs might affect inflation, their response is, oh, that's okay, because the Fed will take care of it. The response is, uh-oh, inflation may just go up and up and up again. So maybe I should just pause there. And again, I opened up a whole bunch more cans of worms.
Yeah, so let's see what Ricardo has to say about the Eurozone. And I guess the situation there, generally speaking, where they are, I mean, we are so US-centric, typically, the economists here, that, they're less up on the day-to-day numbers, but it seemed, my impression generally is that Europe came from under from the COVID recession, did not grow as quickly as the US. That may be changing now with, but there's also a lot of changes that look to be going on there right now, including major increase in spending and armaments, which, I was curious to hear. Do you think that is gonna be enough chunk of money to start moving things? I mean, I don't know anything about weapons or things like that, so I don't really know what that entails. But it seems like something when the ECB director says they're going to spend 800 billion on rearmament over the next few years.
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very interesting one, and I would definitely say that it's an interesting time to be living in Europe. A bit everywhere in the world, but in Europe in particular. Before I go ahead and try and give some context and answer the question, let me also introduce myself, and also let me say too that all I'm going to be saying is just my own opinions. It's not Oxford Economics Opinions, which is my employer. I am with them in the London office, and I cover European countries from a macroeconomic perspective. So we look a bit of an interplay between what financial international markets and international geopolitics, what sort of impact these factors have on national economies, and how national politics, national economic policy, macroeconomic dynamics, all of that comes together. So after this very brief introduction, let me say that it's definitely a very peculiar time. It's definitely a very different time compared to before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we had a very stable world, going back to inflation. Inflation was low. Monetary policy, was trying to resolve the issue, but there was a lot of patience needed. When you have a massive shock with pandemic, global supply chains, massive shock, you have an even more massive one that follows. So you have a Russia-Ukraine war. Europe imports used to import a massive share of its energy from Russia through pipelines, and all of a sudden that gas basically stops flowing. Not completely, but just to get a sense, imagine if you need to fill up the tank of your car, and all of a sudden most tank stations in your town have shut down. I'm a bit exaggerating the point here, just to get a message across, but this is a massive shock. So what we have seen happening in inflation in Europe is not so much of a canonical situation. So you have a lot of external factors, and it's not so much something that relates to supply and demand. Of course, supply and demand always will have played a role, but the massive, the real factor that caused this inflation spike is definitely not excess demand. Now, as always in economics, the answer is a bit depends. You have many factors at play, and all of them again will have an impact. So I think it's very important here to think about the composition on impacts. So we have high energy prices, which had a much larger impact that people were anticipating. That's basically because we haven't had high inflation in years, as Gauti was mentioning before. So people just basically didn't incorporate well how this will have fed through across the whole supply chain. Like because you're facing higher energy prices, but your product is being used by somebody else who's also facing higher prices, and that like splits through to economy. We had wages that endured a very significant shock. So like in 2023 or 2022, I don't know exactly, but like European wages in the Eurozone were at their 2015 level in real terms. So there was a really significant shock, and that is still catching up, and that of course is feeding through to services inflation, because services tend to be naturally most labor intensive. So now much larger introduction compared to when I was introducing myself, but let me get to the point. I think now what we're seeing is a very different approach in Europe. Europe tends to require big external shocks to, I'm thinking above all like the European Union to react to them, and this is one of those. So like they shift in geopolitics, they shift in the US's stance towards Europe, uncertainty that has caused a big reaction, and that has urged European leaders to act and to spend a lot of money for defense. Now, like going like more directly to a point that is a bit akin to a classic shock to demand, but there are a few caveats here. So of course you have more public spending, whether it's for ammunition, whether it's for infrastructure, whether it's for other things. So that is meant to increase demand, and all else equal, we should have more inflation. That's a bit of a textbook answer. If we think about the historical context and like how things are structured at the minute, that is true, but a bit less so. Why? First reason is well, there's a lot of research that military spending has a very low multiplier compared to different kinds of public expenditure, so that will push up demand less. But why even more so in this situation? This is like just a reflection of how military spending is composed in the Eurozone. But in general in Europe, like most of the higher value added equipment and components and inputs are sourced from the US or elsewhere. So basically it's very difficult for European weapons manufacturers to scale up production all of a sudden at a very short notice, especially when a very high value added and know-how is required. So in general, as I said before, like fiscal, defense spending is a kind of fiscal expenditure that has a low multiplier, but in this case, a lot of these extra spending will be met through higher inputs. So that means that demand will not change as much as it could have, like in a more standardized situation, say like in a closed economy. That said, it's a lot of money being spent. It has a lot of potential for new factories being set up in Europe. There are a lot of factories that are operating under capacity. I'm thinking especially about the automotive industry in Germany. So there's a lot of potential for reconversion. So higher capacity utilization, so like more inflationary pressures, but also the uncertainty regarding like reallocation resources that could be that could create like extra blurriness in as far as inflation forecasts are concerned. Very last observation is these extra defense spending is not the only factor at play. Again, we have international energy markets, and we have a European continent which has now got accustomed to adapting in a much swifter way, to energy volatility. Like people now, what companies are like know that they can raise prices, like after inflation expectations have been extremely low, like also in the day-to-day. I'm not just talking about long-term, but also uncertainty. So like uncertainty related to trade policy. So that tends to be a negative shock to demand, which will be deflationary. So been mentioning a lot of factors here, but just throw it out there.
One thing I
So
also want to, apologies, just going to jump in. One thing I'd also want to highlight is the consistent shocks that we will probably see in the future from climate change as well. The climate stability leading to catastrophic changes in our natural weather events as well. That will also be as a source of massive instability that will definitely impact at least the next 10 years.
Yes, and I will actually reinforce a bit the concept here, because there's a lot of uncertainty, as I've already said many times, which is climate related, which is politics related. Are we gonna experience a regionalization of trade? Are global supply chains going to be broken up into much smaller bits? Is that going to impact efficiency so much that will be inflationary? Will they more limited flow of ideas, stifle innovation, and again impact efficiency, so that we have a higher prices for the same product? There's a lot of big question marks here, I think.
Can I ask you a question, Sonny? I think a lot about organizations and how they work, and how can you make good decisions. And I feel like a lot of what I see of this past presidential election in the United States is people being really upset about what happened to the cost of living and the extent to which, for most ordinary people, even if they got pay increases, those pay increases didn't, in many cases, didn't keep up with the increased cost of living. Both reinforces my view that inflation is actually bad for ordinary people, not so bad maybe for wealthy people who can get inflation protection, but also that I think it really eroded trust in elected officials and trust in people who supposedly were doing things to help have a smooth, fast, effective recovery. And when you asked people last year how they feel compared to 2019, a lot of them were not very happy. And so I guess my question, because you're at the Roosevelt Center, you're at a place where there's a lot of concern about how to help ordinary people and disadvantaged people. Why didn't Larry Summers' concerns get more traction in 2021 from people who and he is, by the way, former president of Harvard, and he's a former Treasury Secretary, but he's also works with lots of wealthy people and financial institutions. He's not necessarily viewed as the most progressive person, but I didn't see a lot of progressive concerns in 2021 and 2022 about we really need to make sure that this works well and that this doesn't end up hurting the people that we're trying to help. And so I'm just wondering if you see lessons learned there, what for the future.
Well, let me maybe flip that question a little bit, in the sense that we did see at the lower end of the distribution much higher wage gains than in the higher end. So, which maybe deepens the puzzle in the sense that
I think, but a lot of that's what we would expect, right? Because the people who lost their jobs in the high contact sectors during COVID, there's a big bounce back, and restaurants and hotels, that were recovering, there was pretty strong demand. And so it was, I think, absent fiscal stimulus, the bounce as vaccines were coming out and the recovery.
But even if you just looked at job to job transition, people were really upgrading their salaries.
And so what I'm trying to say is that if, ideally, if and there were concerns about the design of the fiscal stimulus in 2008 and 2009 too, right? So there's nothing really fundamentally new here. It's just what I'm trying to say is that a different design for the fiscal stimulus in 2020 and 2021 might have enabled those big wage gains for at the lower end to stick and be in really big gains in real terms. And unfortunately, I think because of the big pickup in the cost of living, those gains are still there, but a lot of it was eroded away.
Yeah, so I think there's one really big important point that I want to bring up. It's that there's a big difference between, I'm sure, preaching to the choir here, but there's a really big difference between, wages increasing or like between economic like indicators and how people are feeling about economic indicators. One thing that I don't think works is telling people that they're doing fine, that, your wages are increasing, you should be happy, right? Like that doesn't, it doesn't sound too good, So why aren't people feeling it? That's a really good question. That's kind of what Roosevelt has been trying to like discuss for a really long time.
I
A big
think,
part
can
of it,
I
yeah,
come in there for a second? Because I
yeah,
think one of the things that's bugged me for a long time about the Fed is that in the 90s, under Alan Greenspan, the Fed moved away from the CPI to the PCE price index. And at the time, it was because the PCE was viewed as better at doing quality adjustments, and there was some perceived measurement bias in the CPI. And it was a kind of a technical decision. But the reality of it is that the PCE price index puts a lot more weight on, say, Medicare and Medicaid, because those are part of personal consumption expenditures in the national accounts, but they're not part of the at all. They're not at all part of the reality of what ordinary consumers feel.
Not
And then
not to
another piece
mention.
of this is that even the CPI itself puts a lot of weight on owner occupied equivalent rent, which is a completely artificial concept. Um, um, and and so I think, and by the way, some of the improvements in the CPI was changes in car prices, and for a family that's not going out to buy a car, that's also relevant. And so I think part of the distance here between the data that say the Fed was looking at and the reality of what people are experiencing is that the prices of a lot of things that they were paying for had increased a lot. And rents, and we're talking now about the bottom half of the distribution of right rents, gasoline, food prices, medical premiums, out of pocket costs to go to a doctor, right? Those things all increased a lot. The wages were increasing, but just maybe not keeping up with those or barely keeping up with those. And so those people feel really, and they still do, even today, like the latest surveys as of a month or two ago, 75% of people feel like they've fallen behind in terms of their ability to meet the cost of living. And I don't think it's just because, people don't, people don't really understand reality. I think it's because those people know
no,
reality better than we
no,
do.
yeah,
Let,
absolutely. Sorry, I
let me.
apologize. I 100% agree. It's not like it's I would say it's not a like, for lack of a better, it's not a failure of the indicators. It's not a failure of like the people. It's just that the indicators aren't really reflecting what people are really going through. And what I was trying to comment on was the strategy of like saying like, but the stock market's doing so well. It doesn't really resonate. And yeah, exactly. I think you're absolutely correct. I think what a lot of people have, what like a lot of people at Roosevelt and so forth are trying to get at is that there's a growing power gap. It's not just income inequality, but wealth inequality and a lack of real like growth, not just in absolute terms, but in relative terms. When you have the top 1 or the top 10% grow at such a rapid rate, and that is pushing a lot of inflation, when you have, and then combine that with a government that is more like redistributive or as far as and less pre-distributive, instead of like focusing on like building power, building unions, like these sort of softer factors, I guess, that happen before one gets to the market, what those rules that define the market outcomes to begin with. When you have less of focus on that and more on just like, all right, let's try to, there's no doubt that like redistribution, like the stimulus checks had a very real impact on the soft landing, but the lack of, I guess, it's not the lack of, it's the deliberate erosion of power, of economic power and economic democracy that I think people are feeling. and the replacement of that with a sort of like, and that has, I think, fueled a lot of a lot of apprehension from people that when they get stimulus check that are just like, wait, so what's the catch? There's been an active redistribution of power from the bottom to the top, or from the middle class to the top over the, like that's what neoliberalism was. And now, like, you all may disagree, but when you have these, it makes sense that people are apprehensive. And then the same, like what many middle income, lower income people might see is that these very same people are saying, you're doing fine. That probably doesn't sound too good. So I think it really has to do with power and perception and growth in one's like place, as opposed to in relative sense than it does in absolute terms.
Let me add an observation that relates to what both of you are saying. There was a peculiar notion, there's a peculiar phenomena in the surveys that were happening during this period. So when people were being asked, are your economic conditions better than they were, let's say, 2 years ago, they would say yes. But then when they were asked overall our economic conditions, they would say worse. So one way of making sense of that is that people were discounting any increase you get in your wage is due to your unique attributes and hard work, while inflation is somebody else's fault. So there was not an overall, perhaps not an overall appreciation that this was a broad-based increase in wages, as opposed to each individual doing such a wonderful job at their. And another, I would just want to add to, moving from CPI to PCE, sort of to add insult to injury, if you want to measure what people care about. We talk about core, which strips out, the stuff that people actually care about, which is gas and food. I mean, so you take out the stuff from the discretionary budget of those that, especially lower income, and you wind up with stuff that is not as,
Well, the worst, what I guess, you're talking about insult to injury, so I don't know what comes after that. But double insult or something, slap in the face is shelter, which really means rent for most ordinary people. Okay, it's not owner occupied. Okay, it's the rent that you actually pay a rent check. And rents are still rising now at above 4%, right? And the Fed says, oh, well, we're just abstracting from housing. Okay, so they call it super core, right? We'll take out the gasoline and the food and the rent, and then everything else looks a lot better. But the ordinary household's like, well, what else is left exactly? Because the ordinary household doesn't pay, most of them don't pay tuition for private schools, right? They may not be able to even think about buying a new car right now. And so there's a bunch of these other components of the CPI that are there that look a lot better, but they're not relevant for you. Sonny, if Roosevelt Institute is looking there, I've seen a couple of alternative price indices that have tried to, instead of, by the way, this is also connected to some of Gauti's other work, right? When we start thinking about heterogeneity across households, as opposed to thinking of the representative, like a macroeconomic model where there's a representative household, right? And everyone's essentially the same, right? That we should be really thinking the same when we're thinking about price indices, that there's not a single CPI or a single PCE, that there's a price index that's relevant for households that are renting, that are spending a big share of their money on commuting to work every day. They can't do, by the way, we saw this during COVID, the higher income, high net worth people, they all just work from home remotely, right?
There are also really important like racial aspects to these sort of things as well. And so just dividing along income lines will not be sufficient. And like different communities have also different spending. Like my parents are Indian, and I know in the Indian community, it's in also a lot of South Asian communities, it's a big part of your income goes to sending to your folks back home. There are like multiple like aspects of this. And I think what really helps is, these indicators are helpful, but also we do know what a lot of the issues are when it comes to housing. There's a brief that Roosevelt published today. I really wish Arrow were here to talk about that. They've worked so hard on publishing it. And And I do think it comes back to power imbalances.
Sorry, can you post the link to it in chat
Absolutely.
so we can all?
Yeah.
So I think we now are at a stage where I see here in the program says interactive Q&A, and I gather that means that we let the audience interact and ask questions. If I
Yeah, it's great.
understand
I just
correctly.
Gauti, I wanted to come back to one other thing you said though, which is important. Okay. Because another thing went wrong in 2021, not for the first time and probably not for the last. Okay. That a lot of the private economists, a lot of them, Gauti knows many of them, right? A lot of those private economists used to work at the Federal Reserve and they use the same methods that the Fed does. And so during 2021, those same economists at investment banks and other commercial institutions, were also saying, oh yeah, inflation is likely to be transitory. The largest autoregressive root in our model is pretty small, and so just wait a few months. And so the expectations, even in late 2021, was that the Fed wouldn't need to tighten more than a couple notches. Unfortunately, it turned out the Fed needed to raise rates to 5% or more. I mean, to hold rates at 5% more or less for quite a long time. And so these professional forecasters were wrong. They were just wrong in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that reason I say that, Gauti, is because we may or may not be in the same situation today. You said, well, the market, the bond market doesn't see, inflation coming at all. It's only the ordinary consumers and small businesses that are really worried about it. But that was exactly the same situation in spring and summer of 2021. The consumer surveys were going way up, and the inflation expectations from the bond markets were completely subdued.
So you think if the bond market turned to be right?
Well, I'm a big believer in having engagement, diverse views, debates, right?
Yeah.
And so if someone from the bond market wants to explain to me why they think that tariffs could be deflationary, and they point to what happened in 1930 and 31, right? It may be that, in fact, as you say, Gauti,
when I'm going back and thinking about the rationale for the smooth hourly tariffs, it was really just about protecting American industries because the prices of farm goods and had gone. So first, it was thought mostly for farm goods because there was a collapse in commodity prices, and then there was a concerted lobbying effort by manufacturing firms to erect tariffs as well. So that was sort of so the rationale was really to try, because the prices had been crashing for all of these things, and they thought that maybe these protections might allow them to stabilize the prices, and it seems like it just escalated the problem now.
Right. So the point I hadn't thought about until you mentioned it is that the deflation problem in the United States got worse after smooth hauling.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's possible that we're going to see the same thing over the next couple of years. That the effects on the real economy are going to turn out to be pretty miserable, and that inflation actually slows a lot more because we're in a pretty deep recession. I hope that doesn't. That would be terrible for ordinary people, right? If unemployment goes way up, and that's how we end up getting inflation down below 2, is because we have this terrible recession. And we look back and when we say, oh, well, it's because the tariffs didn't have inflationary effects; they actually had deflationary effects. But we don't think tariffs are the right way to bring inflation back to the Fed's target, even if they are deflationary.
But the point here is that you have very different dynamics at play. I don't think Trump will be thinking of introducing tariffs to bring inflation down. I'm thinking more is, again, we can debate whether they are an effective means or not. I do not think they are, but like the political discourse is, I want to make America great again. I want to, increase demand within America. I want to correct the trade deficit, which, by the way, is it definitely is there for goods, but it's definitely not there. Like it's a very different story for services. If we think about or what the tech industry in the US exposed to the rest of the world. So like it's much more complicated, but like I wouldn't I would prefer to avoid focusing too much on the economics of it when sometimes there's not much economics going on there. Like if I'm if I think it's politically important for me to be sending a strong message to my electorate, because it's very easy to depict overseas countries or foreigners or anything like that as a potential enemy, and say just to stigmatize it, say like these people, these countries are causing all your problems, and this is what I'm doing. What I'm doing now is I'm tackling the problem of just like putting tariffs on them by taxing them so you don't have to pay those taxes. I don't think the aim for that is bringing down inflation. I think the aim for that is just like selling
I mean,
yourself.
I think one shouldn't really overcomplicate Trump's tariff policy. I'm one of the few people that actually read the book "Make America Great Again" before he ran. And I mean, I think he really has this view that a deficit means that, or a surplus means that you are profiting off of the other country, and the fact that we are running deficits, they are, we're being suckered. It's just, I mean, he has a sheet apparently with each country. Do I have a surplus, or do I have a profit, or do I have a loss? Profit, loss.
Can I jump in, Gauti? Because I think there's a similarity here in some way between what we were discussing a few minutes ago with Sunny about inflation. Okay, so the economic theory, which has been around for 200 years, like you said, going back to Adam Smith, is that free trade has net positive benefits for society. And so the right thing to do is to move toward free trade, but then have redistribution so that the benefits are distributed evenly across the population. And when I, was an undergraduate in economics back in the dark ages, okay, that's the way it was taught, was just like, it was in a representative agent world. So you just assume that everyone's the same. And there was a kind of a footnote saying if there isn't a representative agent, then you need to have redistributive, and there usually would be assuming that they're called lump sum taxes, which is the simplest possible assumption to make. And I think that what the life experience of people over 30 and 40 years was that there were benefits of increasing free trade for the United States as a society, but they were mostly going to the high net worth individuals and the big companies, and that lots and lots of ordinary workers and ordinary families and disadvantaged communities were being adversely affected without any kind of significant recognition or real effort to try to remediate it. Okay, so then Donald Trump comes along and he can see that, and he taps into that nerve, and he says, look, if you elect me and elect me again, we're going to make America great again. We're going to go back to McKinley. We're going to go back to that. He wasn't looking at Hoover. He was looking at McKinley, to the good old days, when we didn't have all that free trade, and when the United States, and so
but here
if we hadn't made the big mistake in the economic models and in the economists who were out there weighing in favor of free trade, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation we are right now.
I think we need to distinguish between marketing and trying to resolve an issue. Yes, definitely, like these could resonate with a lot of people because, like, as a non-economist, it totally makes sense. Like, I work in a factory in my town. My factory is suffering from Chinese competition, like from other countries. They sell goods for cheaper, the same goods for cheaper. If you put taxes on them, we can be, as competitive as they can be. But at the same time, if we want to think of some ways of improving society, or like making everything fairer, like we are, probably I wouldn't think about lump sum taxes, but there's a whole host of ways to compensate for the income shock. Whereas if we are like saying, okay, I don't like Canada, they didn't want to become the 51st state. I don't like the EU. I don't like Zelensky. You know what? Like, he didn't provide any evidence against Hunter Biden. You know, like, all of that has very little to do with redistribution and everything. And it's like, if even if that were the real aim, like, it would be an extremely inefficient way of doing that. Like, it's like, well, you know, if I got like I got a sore throat, so if I commit suicide, then I won't have any sore throat anymore. Yes, yeah, true. But would you do that? Like, you know, there's very different ways of addressing issues, and I think this is a terrible one, although it may be a very politically palatable one.
So let's, I think we should do some Q&A and open it up, because I guess we're about around time. I suppose I don't know how that works, so maybe somebody backstage
I'm
there
looking
can.
here, and there is a Q&A chat.
Oh.
Let me read. There's 3 questions that came in so far. We can split them
Okay.
up. Emily, sorry, 28 minutes ago, so we were asleep. Governments increase spending to stimulate the economy. How can they ensure that such measures don't feed into inflation? Then Anonymous said, given the global challenge, how important is international cooperation between central banks and governments? And then the third one from Anna 15 minutes ago, could adoption of digital currencies or other financial innovations help stabilize inflation? So those are all great questions. I guess, I don't know, any one of you could take one of them.
There's not a lot of evidence that government spending does actually lead to persistent, or like does actually lead to significant inflation. I think that there's quite a bit on this. I think it's mostly like that argument has been used quite a lot. And going back to what you said, Ricardo, the difference between like economics and marketing, that argument's been used a lot to actively gut government spending, or rather not just gut it, but refocus government spending towards, let's say, like handouts for rich people. So I'd be speaking a little bit careful about like drawing the line between what the papers and economics actually say versus what the marketing says on this topic. That's just one thing I'd like to flag for that.
Yeah, let's focus on the persistent bit of his question. And yeah, I do agree with Sunny's points, of course. So just to elaborate on that, I think it's important to think here, like, well, to realize that, like, very little is persistent in terms of inflation. So unless we have a regime shift, like, you know, like we have inflation expectations permanently higher for, you know, whatever reason. It could be with climate change, you have much more volatility in, so like it's much more difficult to have regular harvesting, and so like food prices go higher, you know, unless you have like a structural regime change like this, or you know, other structural reasons, because, you know, society changes. It's a bit difficult to see a you know, persistent shift in inflation. Now I'm saying inflation, let me restate this, just because inflation is the change in the level of prices. So like having persistently higher inflation is one thing, having persistently higher prices is a different thing. So like in the wake, let me like make an example about Europe, just because it's, you know, it's much easier. Like the level of prices is persistently much higher now after the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war related shocks. So much higher than what you would have imagined, like according to you know, like historical inflation, like if you would have extended the trend. So you do have a persistent change in the level of prices, but expecting a persistent change in the level of inflation is a very different thing. And like unless you have a government that all of a sudden becomes much less reliable, you know, think like, for example, like an episode where you have the government going bankrupt, or like just spending too much, and really market agents and consumers start realizing that there's not going to be any coming back from that. Well, but in that case, like if you only have some expansionary fiscal policy, it's very unlikely that the shock to inflation will be persistent. Yeah, I don't know if we want to move on to another questions, or if any other speakers have anything.
No, I just want to say that I think this comes back to the point I made earlier, that in normal times when the economy is close to its balanced growth path, making adjustments to spending and taxes, and there may be moderate changes in deficits and debts and all those things. We wouldn't expect them to have very much effect on inflation, and certainly not persistent effects on inflation. And we count on the central bank over time to adjust monetary policy so that inflation does stay close to the target. And that's what Canada and Britain and Sweden and Japan and many other countries have been doing for a long time. I think what was different in 2021 was the supply of the economy was very constrained, and the government did an enormous increase in stimulus. And again, this is the conclusions, of the Doug Elmendorf and Karen Tynan's analysis, is that really is what pushed up the price level a lot, because it's just standard supply and demand. That the demand was way higher than supply for a while. I think
also,
better design would have been one where more of the structural things were phased in over a longer period, so that as supply is catching up, the demand is starting to rise more.
But I think you need there, Andy, though. I mean, that's been the work that I've been doing. Like the models that you and I were working with when we were at the Fed, we're saying that these increases in demand are not going to have a big inflationary effect due to the low slope of the Phillips curve. So you need some sort of capacity constraint, which I think we're hit.
Yeah, right. And I think there was work at the IMF, and some of it was cross-country analysis, that there were reason to think that the Phillips curve wasn't log linear at all levels of supply and demand, that it probably hit nonlinear regions. The flatness was way out when demand's way lower than supply, and the steepness is when demand's way higher than supply. And so I think the concerns of Larry Summers, who's a smarter guy, and he knows all the macroeconomic models, was the concern that we might be hitting that very steep part of the Phillips curve in 2021. And I think, to me, that's essentially what the analysis of Dinan and Elmendorf have concluded. We need to do more modeling, more empirical analysis, and more cross-country analysis. But the answer to Emily's question in my mind is be careful, have contingency planning, have robust debates among people with different points of view. Don't dismiss someone and say, "Oh, you're just a crank." In retrospect, I think there are a lot of public policymakers who are now out of office who wish they had listened more carefully to some of those people in 2021 and 2022.
well, just one last thing. I'd also like to say that the supply shocks they didn't happen in a vacuum. They didn't happen the markets themselves were very concentrated in a lot of these areas, which did lead to very real increases in prices afterwards. So it's not just the demand side of it, but also the fact that TSMC is just one company, right? I mean, the concentration over time of American markets to fewer and fewer companies having more and more power. So in that case, there's when a shock like that happens, it is these companies with more market power can clearly exert more pressure in the markets, raising prices. So yeah, it's these things don't I agree. I'm sure that I haven't read the paper that you were mentioning, Professor Levin, but yeah, these in combination, I'd like to bring up the market power aspects as well.
So I guess we are over time. So I guess maybe it's time to conclude, if I understand correctly, unless you have any other questions here. Thank you all for listening. I guess we all now know where inflation is going. Um, but with that, do the organizers want to say anything? Or?
Well, I would like to just say thanks to the organizers and thanks to our audience. I'm sorry we fell short in answering some of the questions. There's one from Anna about digital currencies. I think Anna can my email is public. You can send me a question. We can correspond or have a Zoom chat sometime. And also, Sunny, I really appreciate the work Roosevelt's doing and you and your colleagues are doing. And this paper that you flagged in the chat, I pulled it up. About the persistence of the housing affordability. We should all be aware of the fact that the homelessness problem has been getting a lot worse in the last couple of years, and those are people we should all be we should care about. And what I hear here in New Hampshire and Vermont from people who run homeless shelters is that a lot of those homeless people now are people who just cannot afford to pay the rent. And so the extent to which the Federal Reserve is saying, oh, well, we're going to create super core and we're going to abstract from rent along with food and gasoline, right? They need some pushback to say,
people don't need to eat, they don't need to live anywhere, and they don't need to drive.
And you don't need to get to work. Anyway, Ricardo, thanks a lot to you also for joining us. And it's late at night, your time, I guess, but we really appreciate it.
It's doable, but but also very much worthwhile. I've been discussing all these topics with you. Very interesting and very lively conversation. So more happy to join, and I hope I contribute a bit positively to the conversation. And thank you again to all my fellow speakers, but the organizers and the audience as well, and for questions especially.